My name's Kevin Anderson. I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Change here at the University of Manchester, and I also work at the University of Uppsala in Sweden.
Why don't we just start with a rundown of the key facts around climate change? What are the latest insights that you have?
The latest insights that we have, and I should say I focus specifically on the energy issue. So firstly, let's just not park, but recognise that agriculture is a huge part of the challenge. Probably about 20% of the warming overall comes from agriculture. And there's a lot we can do there, but we cannot eliminate the emissions from agriculture. There will always be some emissions of greenhouse gases. So I focus on energy, where we have to eliminate all the emissions. And the key outputs, I think, from our most recent work, which is actually in press at this moment, is that at a global level, if you carry on at current emissions, then we will use up the total carbon budget, the total amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit to stay even at the 2 degree C framing, not really at the 1.5, at the 2 degree C framing, in about 18 years. We'll have used up all of that. But also the Paris Agreement and the Copenhagen Accord and every other agreement we've had going back through to the 90s emphasises the importance of equity. And I think equity is the other absolutely key issue. And I would argue that the science plus the Paris Agreement, then if you had an equals to that, it will equal equity. Now, that's not a political statement, it's not a moral statement, it's a mathematical statement. And for that, what I mean there is that the poorer parts of the world will have to have longer to make that transition. That was locked into the Paris Agreement and previous agreements. That means that the wealthy parts of the world, we have about 9 years, 6 to 9 years for Sweden and the UK that have done this work for, before we blow our carbon budget at current emissions. So what's that play out like? That plays out at reducing emissions at about 10 to 15% per annum, depending on quite how you look at this. And then think about that. That means in the next 3 years, reducing our emissions by about a third. By 2030, just a decade from now, to reduce our emissions by about 70% or so. And to be fully decarbonised energy, no carbon, no fossil fuel use, by about 2035. 2035, 15 years from now. Planes, trains, ships, industry, everything. Zero carbon energy by 2035. In 2020, there is no non-radical alternative. We either have to deal with 3 to 5 degrees centigrade of warming, which is a radically different world from the one we live in today, that will occur in a sort of ecosystem point of view just overnight, across this century. By the end of the century, it could be 3 to 5 degrees warmer if we just carry on failing like today. And that will mean radical change. And it will be chaotic radical change. Or we reduce our emissions at such a rapid rate that also means radical change. But unpick that a little bit more, and it's radical change for who? The equity part is key within countries, not just between countries. In a country like the UK, a highly unequal society, most of the emissions will come from a small percentage of the population. At a global level, half the world's emissions come from the activities of about 10% of the population. That will hold for a country that's as unequal as is the UK. So here it's not radical change for everyone, it's radical change for 10 to 20, possibly as much as 30%. But the other majority of the population will see incremental, significant change, but not a fundamental, radical change to how they're living their lives. Most people in the UK are relatively low emitters. The problem is that most of the people who are the high emitters are the climate scientists, the barristers, the journalists, the policymakers, the entrepreneurs, the business leaders. All the people that develop the framing, the policies to deal with climate change are the high emitters. And they are very reluctant to develop policies that require radical, profound changes to how they are living, how we are living.
Well, we have to protect the status quo.
And that, of course, is more important than anything else, is protecting the status quo. So we'll almost adjust the laws of physics. We'll postulate technologies in the future rather than question the current short-term economic and political framing of society. And that is still the case today. Most academics who work on the reducing emissions, not on the science itself, but on reducing emissions, are, in my view, mitigation deniers. We are not prepared to accept what our own science and analysis tell us about the sorts of levels of change that we require. And let's remember, we require the changes now because we have chosen to fail for 30 years.
I just wanted to focus on travel now, and the tourism sector, and some of those facts that you mentioned. How might they impact some of our favourite destinations to visit?
Well, in terms of getting to them, it's going to be much more challenging to get to them. And when we say challenging, you could say, turn that word around, much more interesting to get to them. If people like an adventure is being on a bus travelling through the Atlas Mountains in Morocco rather than flying overhead. So, it depends what we're looking for. Yeah. But in terms of tourism, I think the adventure part can be wrapped up in how we get places. And we should, of course, firstly be thinking about exploring the environment around us. But if we are going to go to places elsewhere, that's further away, then think about how do we get there slowly? How do we restructure our lives? I'm not saying this is going to be easy, it's going to be challenging, but restructure our lives so we go less often, but we maybe go for longer. So that if you're going to take, it took me 11 days to get to Shanghai. If it takes you 11 days to get to Shanghai, and that was not for tourism reasons, that was for work reasons, most of my colleagues flew there for one day and flew back the following day. But if it takes you 11 days to get there and 11 days back, I couldn't do that. So I had to then spend 3 weeks in China doing a lecture tour and so forth. So we have to reschedule these things. And that's not going to be easy. It's not, everyone says it's not possible for them. But of course we have done this in the past. So we have travelled around the world, at least as a species. Not everyone has, but many of us have done. But also I think it's worth unpicking that, who are the travellers? Most of my immediate friends where I live in Glossop, they've never been to university. They're working class lads and lasses. And it's not them that are driving the travel. I mean, they do fly. They don't think about this from an environmental point of view. They might fly once every second year, and they might go to Benidorm, and they might go to Egypt. But they're not the ones that are frequent flyers. Remember that the tourism and the travel is by a particular group of society, by and large. And in that group, it's the frequency with which they're choosing to fly, and how often, and it's not just the frequency and how far they're going as well. And so again, as with all of these issues, equity comes out as key. Is we're talking about changes in terms of how often this particular small group of highly mobile elite group, which of course I am part, we have normalised our lifestyles, and for them it's going to be profound change. But in terms of the impacts of climate change, they're going to play out more obviously in some of the more climate vulnerable parts of the world, and whether you're going to see the barrier reef, or you're going to look at how that might be in many places in some of the Pacific Islands and so forth. But I think we also have to recognise in places that are much more insulated from some of the earlier impacts of climate change, the direct impacts, where we still get the indirect impacts. So what happens to the tourist spots across Europe, they will be changed by other things that happen. If we look at what's happened since the war in Syria, which was not a climate change war, it was probably exacerbated by 12 years of drought, but what we saw there was a migration into Europe of a lot of Syrians, and that changed how we view a lot of parts of Europe. It made it it gave a different feel when you went to other parts of Europe. Remember, that was just a few people that came here. And most Syrians actually went to Jordan and Lebanon. We always, and look at how we start to break down Schengen, the free movement of people within Europe because of what was happening there. So even in probably one of the most sophisticated and in some respects insulated parts of the world from climate change, we started to see some changes occur very rapidly with small levels of migration. Climate change, if we do not reduce our emissions, will involve much more migration of species, of humans, and that means that even places that we like to think are insulated, like when I work in Sweden, they like to think they're a long way from the impacts of climate change. They're not, of course. They're already suffering the impacts of migration, or benefiting and suffering from them, depending on how you look at these issues. So I think that that everywhere will be impacted, either directly or indirectly, by climate change. And the more we fail, the more we choose to fail, the worse those sets of impacts will be.
Those kind of structural changes, the societal level that you're talking about, I mean, I have a theory that because these incremental, relatively kind of small, isolated weather events that might be connected or might not be, will be outstripped by a sort of monumental, biblical kind of West Antarctic ice sheet collapsing level of disaster. And it might only be that actually wakes people up and think, okay, fine, we need to vote some governments in that will actually make a difference here. What do you say to that?
If we wait for that, I think it'll probably be too late. Yeah. I mean, great, these things can help to some extent, and I'd rather our generation that's caused the problem, particularly if it can hit the wealthy people who have caused this issue, if it can hit them, then the sooner it hits them, the better. But that's not how these things play out. Yeah. And they generally hit the poor, low emitters elsewhere. So I think that many people have been hit or have lived through really serious climate-oriented events, or events that have been exacerbated by climate change. So if you look at what happened in Mozambique last year, you look at some of the Haiyan, you look at what happened in Katrina, you look at what's happening with the fires in Australia earlier this year. All these things, to more or less extent, have been exacerbated, not necessarily caused by, but exacerbated by climate change. But often they happen to poor people. And to be blunt again, we have to recognise we do not care about poor people a long way away who we see as quite different from us. So I think if we're going to wait for these sort of events to be the ones that catalyse change, we'll have pretty much left it too late. So let's recognise the early signs that we're seeing now. Let's not overplay what we see, attributing the particular events we're seeing, weather events, to actual climate change events is difficult. We know that these fit broadly with our models. We are seeing some early signals from a sort of overall statistical point of view. So I think we have fairly clear evidence that our models are correct, but we're seeing these impacts with just 1 degree centigrade of warming. And we're not going to stay at 1 degree centigrade of warming. We are rapidly warming. So we expect these things to get much, much worse. So we've got no reason, either from our empirical work, from our basic physics, or from our models, to question that this is wrong. We know which direction we're heading. And despite what some of the skeptics, the deniers say, you must part them to one side. It's not climate science, it's just physics. There's no such thing as climate science. It's just science. It's not some new fangled thing that's been developed. It's using the rules that tell us why planes stay in the air, why our mobile phones work. We use the same physics, the same science to understand climate. And that tells us fairly clearly where we're heading.
Given the relationship between economic growth and pollution, is there any way to bring it back to travel again? For example, the aviation industry, can they grow economically and sustainably?
No, not in the short to medium term, without any doubt. And sustainable growth is very challenging as well. From a climate point of view, the answer is absolutely no. But even if you had zero carbon planes, the answer may still well be no, because there were lots of other implications from a material use, a whole suite of things to do with how any activity that has a lot of material and energy use may well be at some point unsustainable above a certain level. So it may well be that even if you had electric planes, and a lot of people talk about this, can we have electric planes, can we have biofuels and the rest of it? But then you have to start to think, well, given that every other sector is struggling to meet its required reductions, is it appropriate to allocate these scarce resources, renewable energy, scarce at the moment in terms of what we have access to, is it appropriate to use the very scarce sustainable biomass and biofuels that we may have available? The sustainable ones, there's a very small proportion of those. Is it right to use those to allow the relatively wealthy to carry on with their lifestyles? Or should those fuels be used to allow hospitals to run, to allow our houses to be heated, to allow public transport for everyone to use? So it's again, even there, when people say, well, let's have electric planes, that means we're going to use renewable power that could be heating people's houses instead for the flights of a few people who are flying regularly around the world. So I think even there you have to start to question these things.
Why is it called sustainable development then, if there's no way that can really happen?
Well, firstly, what do you mean by development and what do you mean by growth? They're not synonyms. I think economists like to think they are, but I think many of us would argue they're nothing like that. But it goes right back to Gro Brundtland, who was who developed the sort of the whole concept of sustainable development in her UN report back in, I think, 1989, I think it was. And that whole sort of idea of pursuing sustainability whilst thinking about the prospects of future generations. So you don't want to reduce their prospects to live sustainable lives, and that sort of sets of trade-offs across time. That was all thought about quite carefully then, but it was also, there was a lot of discussion at the time. What does it really mean? What do we mean by development? And I think as we've progressed through time, the economists have sort of taken that on and almost interpreted it and translated that into meaning economic growth. So we talk about green growth, all of this sort of language, which I think is hugely problematic. But there are whole swathes of academics and industry and business people working on this sort of concept. And I think it misunderstands some of the fundamentals of thermodynamics. We are on a round planet, and you can't have ongoing growth. And they use the language of decoupling, that will decouple growth from material input. Well, you can never completely decouple growth from material input. Certainly you can have a growth in female literacy. You can have a growth in river quality. You can have a growth in a whole set of services. But often those things will play out in the end. If someone's providing those services, they'll get something that they may want to buy some material good. So some way along the line, that will play out as more material consumption. And you can't have ongoing growth forever on a round planet. This has been shown years ago by Georgescu, Rogan and others who looked at this thermodynamically. And yet the economists carry on with this fairy tale, or a certain group of economists who are very dominant in politics. And we are now in this point where we are so locked into that paradigm of ongoing economic growth. And remember, it's ongoing economic growth that generally the majority of that growth goes towards the relative few, with a sort of view that the trickle down will help the poorer people. But it is those of us who, again, are the high emitters, we will consume most of the products of that growth. And we don't want to question that because we are enjoying the increased quality of our lives at the expense of other people elsewhere on the planet and our own children. But we don't want to question that. And so what we've done, we've developed a whole industry of people who are very eloquent, very well educated, but basically it's using calculus to mask the idea that it's little more than astrology. And that's what I think a lot of economics is. It looks complicated because it's got lots of mathematical symbols, but that does not make it any more than a mathematical interpretation of astrology when you look at the scale of the challenges that we're actually facing. And I think we've developed an industry that allows that green growth metaphor to sound quite appealing. But when you unpick it, it completely unravels and you realise there's nothing underneath it at all. So it's a facade. And so we come back to this point of what do we mean by growth? What do we mean by development? We've got to go back to revisit those things. And most of us would argue that we want to see more material growth amongst the poor people in the world, including some in our own country. But that means we have to have less material consumption by the wealthy in our societies. We want to see improvements in female literacy. We want to see improvements in air quality. These sorts of things we want to see grow. That doesn't mean we want to grow how many products we own, how many houses we have, how big our car is, how far we fly. Those things are things that consume more goods and more materials, more energy, and are not viable on a round planet if we are thinking of playing it out across 9 billion people.
All these status symbols that, as a society, we aspire towards, like the bigger car, the longer flights, the holidays, etc. Just because the many don't have that and the few do, doesn't mean that if there's a sort of redistribution of wealth, that those many won't want the same things. So, I mean, it's a nice segue into my next question about actually painting a picture that's more positive when you're not doing all those indulgences, you might say, and that's why we did our Green Weekend, for example. I was going to plug that now. And what do you say to that? Is it a matter of inspiring people?
It is, but I think we also have to again remember that our social groups are different. Like I said before, that we are culturally different across the world, but we're also culturally different within our societies. So, I think we referred to earlier, my closest friends never been to university. And their attitude towards a good life is very different from those that I engage with here in universities. The ones in universities always seem to be about what they would see as progress, which basically means bigger house, fly further, bigger car. Actually, the ones that I spend my time cycling with and rock climbing with and going down to the pub with, that's not really their view of what's a good life. I mean, they want to have a reasonable life. They want a reasonable house that's relatively warm. They want a nice-ish car, but not that fussed about the car. They fly occasionally. They want to go down to the pub out for the beer. They want to go out for a nice meal from time to time, and they want to have fun with their friends. It's a very different sense. And I think you could again, I apologise, there's a very UK focus here, but that's the country I know best. If you look at the UK, I've spent a lot of my time living in and having friends in areas where there's community, where they are what we traditionally would call working class communities. And in those, I think the sets of aspirations are very different. And certainly in terms of scale, they're very different to the sorts of environments where you find lots and lots of academics living, lots and lots of people who are already very wealthy living. And I think there's almost like, in some respects, when those working class communities have reasonable homes and reasonable transport and lots of reasonable things, they're actually relatively happy with that. And so I think we can look to within our own cultures and saying, well, where is it we see quite a lot of contentment and happiness? There's been lots of work looking at this, at the parts of the world where the indices of quality of life, of literacy rates, of life expectancy, all these things are sort of pulled together, happiness indexes and quality of life indices, and they always show the same sorts of countries in there. I'm not saying they're perfect countries, Costa Rica, Cuba, countries like this, lots of other issues, but nevertheless what you find are these countries have relatively low consumption of material goods and energy per capita, but have actual indicators of good quality of life that are certainly as high as those of most European countries, and often higher than some of the people in like the US.
What's the secret?
Well, this is the point. That's the trick, and that's what some academics are looking at. So why is it these countries are so satisfied? And actually, countries with high levels of inequality are often shown to be ones that are relatively unhappy, and that's including within cities. You see that. So we have at least a good sense of where to start to investigate for more progressive views of what a progressive future might look like. Now, I don't say we have to replicate those. We'd have to go back to the past. We learn lessons from the past, good and bad lessons. We try and learn from, and then we paint this progressive picture for the future. But I think if we interpret the future as just a place where, the sort of place where academics would like to live, where the wealthy would like to live, that's massively problematic. We as academics and who look at these sorts of issues have to go outside of our own comfort zone and look at other parts of the world and other parts of our own societies, which are often just a few kilometres away, where there's a sense of belonging, a sense of community, a sense of contentment. One that often we don't recognise because we're never in that position, because we're always trying to pursue our next rung up the ladder, as I think a lot of these other communities are not. At the end of the day, we're in a rationing issue. We want to stay within 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. Unfortunately, I don't think we can achieve 1.5 anymore, unless the negative emissions work at some huge scale, and we reduce emissions rapidly. So we have a certain amount of carbon that we can emit if we're going to stay within these commitments that we've made at Paris. And we know what it looks like. It's a carbon budget. It's like having a salary for life. And we need to recognise that within these negotiations, which we never do. And then we have to recognise we have to divide that budget amongst all parts of the world, all countries in the world. And until we actually recognise that, everything else is fluff and nonsense, to be honest. We're not going to solve the problem until we recognise we have to stay within a certain amount of carbon dioxide emissions. We'll try all sorts of accounting scams and blaming other people, but in reality, that's what we've got to stay within. And then we have to say, well, how do you allocate that cake out, that pie? How do you split the pie out fairly between Ghana and Nigeria, between the US and China, between the UK and wherever else? So we've got to split that cake up in a fair fashion. Until we recognise that and grasp that really challenging, nettle, if you like, then we're going to fail on climate change. And I rather hope the UK, to its credit, and I'm usually very critical of the UK on many aspects of sustainability and climate change, but to its credit, the Climate Change Act in 2008 and the Climate Change Committee in the UK, who I'm also highly critical of in many respects, but they do have a carbon budget framing. They have a framing for the UK which is broadly in line with what the science requires. Unfortunately, the carbon budgets are far, far too large, informed by a very colonial view, typical British view, that we should get a bigger slice and other poor countries will have to suffer the consequence. But nevertheless, we do actually have a scientific foundation, and it's that foundation that we need to develop within COP26 at a global level. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but until we actually are prepared to grasp that and do something about it and recognise that challenge, we will continue to fail.
How do you persuade, for example, the hypothetical I always give is Steve living in Kildare, someone from Northumberland or wherever, maybe not kind of London focused and likes to fly on holiday but can't afford it, manages to save up enough money over a few years to take his family on his first holiday abroad, package holiday, Thomas Cook, let's say it was a year ago, and they're flying to Malaga and they're going to stay at the Hilton for a week, and Steve's just going to sit on the beach and enjoy his pina coladas. How do you persuade him to travel sustainably, travel slow, take more time perhaps?
I probably wouldn't. I mean, okay, if I'm having a beer with them, and in fact, I think that would capture quite well some of my friends in Glossop. We chat about these things. They ask me about these sort of things, and I chat to them, but I don't say they shouldn't be doing it. I mean, they're doing it occasionally. It's not the flying that matters, it's the carbon emissions. My guess is that by and large, the carbon emissions for these people the rest of the time, relative to the average in the UK, is probably quite low. So I think we have to, again, this is the point about equity. We have to be 1% you're talking. Well, not just 1%. I mean, it's more than that. It could be, in the UK, it's probably 10 to 30%, but that still means that somewhere between 70 and 90% of the people aren't in that group. Let's try and persuade them to make some changes if I can. But by and large, I'm less concerned about them. I'm actually more interested in discussing with them about them engaging with their policymakers about driving policy changes locally or within their companies or nationally. So I think their engagement in these issues and saying these things have to be fair to allow them to occasionally fly or drive or whatever it might be. So their engagement in these issues is more important than actually them changing their behaviours. The important thing about changing behaviour, and this is, I often get, I think, accused of this, I think unfairly, but it's perhaps the language I use. But the important thing about changing behaviour is not related to the emissions themselves, but that it then gives us the authority to discuss these issues. And we know from repeated social science research that actually the credibility of our message is improved if people sort of see that what you're doing is broadly in line with them. Bloody obvious in my view, but anyway, it's important. It has been shown from the science to be like that. And so therefore making the changes ourselves and then talking about them with our colleagues and our friends and our families is important, even when things are difficult. Say I tried this and it just didn't work, or I did that and I found it really difficult. But so talking about them honestly, the successes and the problems, and then we open up that dialogue, that space. But I wouldn't want to criticise Steve or Jane or anyone else that was flying to other parts of the world occasionally. It's not them that we have to really focus our attention on.
What little change can people make today or or what can they do today to have a positive impact tomorrow?
So the three things I sort of say to people, well, what can I do? First, I turn around and say, I know a 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl that said exactly that a few years ago, and look what she's done. So this is the point about the emergent property. We don't know where the next change will come from. It'll probably emerge from the bottom up rather than the top down. And our role in this as individuals is to try and identify the things in our lives that we think aren't quite so sustainable or low or too high carbon, and try and change them. And if we're high emitters with very, fly a lot and drive a lot and live a big house, there are lots of big things we can do. But even other people can make some change. But let's be clear, the changes themselves don't matter so much, as it gives us the chance and the opportunity and the authority to talk with others. So you've then got to talk with our friends and our family and our work colleagues about this, what we're doing, how things were easy, how things were difficult, what things you're going to try and do differently in the future. But also important to engage within the place that we work. So in schools, hospitals, your company, whatever that might be, about the things that they can be doing in the company. Try and think that through. What could they do that would make things more sustainable, that reduce their energy consumption, reduce their emissions, make them more sustainable? But then engage also with our councils. And the councils are really important. I think people often sort of think we should leapfrog those and go to the MPs. But actually, talking about things locally is very important. We understand our local environment much better than people do at national level. We have the same sort of accents sometimes, we have the same sort of colloquialisms. So I think there's again a sense of credibility if you're talking about your local area and you know it well. But in addition to that, I think we also need to engage with our members of parliament. And they will not always get back to us, but they will listen to what we have to say one way or another. And if they're going to get lots of emails or lots of tweets or even lots of letters about a subject, they will start to think this is an important issue. So don't always expect to get a reply, but feed into that process. So engage across that. But also remember, not always to be critical, and that's important to be courteously critical of people, courteously and firmly if you think they're doing things which are not right and are not aligned with, say, our carbon targets and so forth. But also, when people do things that are good, to let them know that you think that's a positive move. And we're not very good at that in the UK. So I think if a minister or a council tries to do something that's really moving in the right direction, let them know you think that. And if you think it's not enough or we need to do something else, say that as well, but be constructive in our comments.
Like Bristol Airport, the decision recently.
The decision there on the M4, when they decided not to go ahead with that as well, the Welsh government. So let them know, well done, that's really important. So we need to start to be more positive about things and help us develop a progressive view of the future, rather than always one that's always about moaning and groaning and complaining.
It's a nice way to end on reasons to be cheerful.
Ian Jury.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Great talking to you.
Thanks very much.